This episode of Getting Warmer, can we reverse climate change?
Within the community that's starting to develop carbon removal technologies, it's becoming a bit of a consensus that we'll likely need gigatons or billions of tons of carbon removal annually by 2050.
Hey, I'm Kal Penn, and this is Getting Warmer. Look, I'm a natural optimist, okay? Like, I've never bought an extended warranty in my life, and I genuinely think it's possible for humanity to pull together and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But even if every country reached the net zero targets committed to in the Paris Agreement, we're still on track for several decades of warming. And that's got a lot of people who are less optimistic than me considering some very extreme plan Bs.
Could blocking out the sun actually help reduce the temperature?
China says it will try to protect its grain harvest from intense drought by using chemicals to generate rain,
creating a massive chemical cloud that could cool the Earth.
Are reflecting sunlight to cool the planet, such as with space-based mirrors.
Now, maybe you find it easier to imagine quitting fossil fuels than to imagine surrounding the Earth with giant space mirrors. But it's worth getting familiar with some of these last resorts so that you can decide for yourself whether they belong in the world of science fiction or science nonfiction. So let's start with one of the biggest ideas. It's called stratospheric aerosol injection. This is where we replicate volcanic eruptions by shooting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight, cooling the planet. So basically, we would counteract the pollution in our lower atmosphere by injecting a different kind of pollution into the upper atmosphere. As you probably guessed, because you're not an idiot, there is a downside. First, you'd need to keep this up indefinitely. And second, studies show that it could cause severe droughts in the global south, which has some pretty serious humanitarian ramifications. And political ones. Because if one country shoots chemicals into the sky and it ends up killing a bunch of people in another country, that might technically make it a bioweapon? I don't know, feels problematic. Moving on. A more grounded backup plan is to recover the fossil fuels that we burn and literally bury them underground. This is called carbon removal. We're already doing this, actually, on a small scale. And there are two kinds. One is carbon capture and storage. Think of this as like a giant Roomba duct taped to the top of a smokestack. It collects CO2 as it's emitted, and then it sends it for further processing, or it stores it underground. Currently, only about 0.1% of global emissions are captured with this method. But America's landmark climate law, which 0 Republican senators voted for, has provisions to increase its use 13-fold by 2030. The other carbon removal method, slightly more science fiction-y, is called direct air capture. If carbon capture and storage is like a Roomba duct taped to a smokestack, then direct air capture is like a Roomba for the whole sky. Skyba. This is the world's largest direct air capture plant in Iceland. It takes 4,000 tons of CO2 from the air each year. Unfortunately, that only covers the emissions of about 250 Americans. Ramping up carbon capture and storage to a meaningful scale would require tens of thousands of these things running for decades, using a massive amount of energy and storing all that captured carbon underground forever. But in spite of those challenges, investment is ramping up from private companies and the American government, which is spending $3.5 billion to develop 4 direct air capture hubs. But if these giant life support machines for the Earth are a little too desert planet of Arrakis for your taste, there are more natural options. The world's oceans are natural carbon sinks, and some scientists have experimented with ways to get the oceans to absorb more CO2. Like ocean fertilization. The idea here is to stimulate the growth of plankton, which soaks up carbon, and you do that by dumping huge amounts of iron into the ocean. Look, I said it was an idea. I didn't say it was a good idea. Another ocean experiment under investigation is deacidification, where we make the ocean less acidic by, again, dumping stuff into it, in this case, rocks. Scientists in Norway are currently researching what impact changing water's pH levels would have on oceans' ecosystems. So we traveled there to get a closer look at their operation. We also checked in on a company growing carbon-sucking algae in Morocco. Are these viable ideas to combat climate change? Or will messing with the oceans get us all into hot water? Hot, salty water. Let's take a look. Oceans are some of the most efficient CO2 absorbers out there, sucking out 25% of our emissions each year.
Ocean-based carbon capture is the idea that we can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by accelerating natural processes.
Keeping even vaguely in line with our global warming targets means cutting our emissions. But even that won't be enough. So we'll need to go further. And for that, carbon capture would have to scale up fast.
Within the community that's starting to develop carbon removal technologies, it's becoming a bit of a consensus that we'll likely need gigatons or billions of tons of carbon removal annually by 2050. This is an absolutely enormous challenge. There's about 8 gigatons of coal produced annually. This is one of the most handled materials in the world. So if we're going to scale the carbon removal industry, it needs to become something along the lines of the coal or the oil and gas industry.
Ulf Riebesil is among the growing number of scientists who believe that ocean-based carbon removal could have a large role to play here.
Certainly the ocean carries a very high potential for CO2 removal, but we have very little understanding at the moment of what the potential risks and side effects of that are.
We're now here just south of Bergen in Norway, where we had a 55-day experiment, which we just completed now.
Ulf and his team are running a study funded by the European Union, testing out a method called alkalinity enhancement, which essentially is changing the water's pH in the hope of boosting its CO2 absorbing powers. pH is a scale which shows how acidic something is. It goes from acidic at the lower end to alkaline at the higher end, in case you forgot your high school chemistry. Oceans have become more acidic as they absorb more carbon dioxide. The team submerged 10 mesocosms. Those are giant, 20-meter-long test tubes filled with water from the ocean. Then they added different concentrations of chemicals found in natural rocks like lime or volcanic olivine to change the water's pH and make it more alkaline.
So we simulated alkalizing seawater in our mesocosms, trying to see whether there's any harm done to marine life, and to test whether it takes up more CO2.
Think of opening a bottle of sparkling water. That hiss you hear is the gas escaping because there's more of it in the bottle than in the air. The reverse happens with oceans absorbing atmospheric carbon dioxide.
Because we've been emitting CO2, there's now this reverse imbalance, where there's too much CO2 in the air compared with the water, and the water is starting to absorb CO2 from the air.
All of this CO2 being absorbed is making the water more acidic. This not only wreaks havoc on marine life, but it's also slowing down the ocean's intake of carbon dioxide. Alkalinity enhancement could counteract all of this. By dumping a huge amount of pulverized minerals into the ocean every year and turning the water more alkaline, it would increase the rate of natural chemical reaction, which breaks down CO2 into compounds, making more room for the ocean to absorb additional CO2.
Alkalinity enhancement kind of seems like a chemical solution, but it's a natural process. Rocks are weathered through reaction with water and CO2. And that releases alkalinity into fresh waters, and via rivers, this extra alkalinity is supplied into the ocean. The process is very slow, though, and the idea of alkalinity enhancement is to speed up this natural process.
It's the last day of the study, and the team is retrieving the mesocosms and sending the samples for analysis in partner institutions around the world. It's a method that still requires an incredible amount of fine-tuning.
There's a whole set of unknowns. The mineral needs to be ground very finely, otherwise it will just sink out to the ocean floor and not be of any use for CO2 sequestration. If you increase alkalinity too high, that counteracts the effect you want to achieve. It releases CO2 instead of sequestering CO2. And then, of course, there's the risk of harming marine ecosystems.
Hacking the oceans like this is seen by many as borderline, if not straightforward, geoengineering, and there is criticism in the scientific community that it could unleash yet another environmental catastrophe. To minimize any potential impact on the environment, some companies are trying to do ocean-based carbon capture without an ocean. One of them is betting on algae, an organism which removes carbon from the atmosphere for a living.
Algae are the original carbon sequesterers. 80 million years ago, algae that grew on very large scale in inland oceans formed the oil deposits that we are mining today. They are, in nature, sinking out from the ocean, collecting in the seabed, and then stored there for millions of years. And we are just trying to repeat that process deliberately and maybe a little bit more quickly. Algae are plants. They photosynthesize, which means they take carbon dioxide and sunlight and turn it into sugars and starches and cellulose and bodily functions. And so in the process, they release oxygen, and that carbon is then embedded in the biomass in the cells.
Thanks to photosynthesis, algae are another way the ocean absorbs CO2, and there are hundreds of thousands of different kinds of them. People have tried growing algae for biofuel for years, and often these projects were using species that were best suited or even engineered for oil production. Now, they were brought straight from the lab to the desert, but organisms would struggle in these new intense conditions. Ponds would get contaminated with local species, and the projects would fail. And failure is so common that the oil giant ExxonMobil, which has funded algae research for years, believes this technology is still decades away from being able to scale. But Brilliant Planet claims to have a solution. Strip down as much technology and engineering as possible and let nature take over.
Our system is very natural, which means we do not pump in lots of nutrients, we do not pump in a lot of CO2. And we spent a lot of time stripping out energy and complexity out of the system. We work with local natural algae. They are very good in that local environment. It's an open system, so we fully expect other organisms to be introduced into our ponds through the seawater. But it does not matter, because our organisms are growing faster than they are. They're acclimated to those conditions, and they then overwhelm anything that comes into the ponds.
The company identified coastal deserts as optimal locations for their needs. Their pilot plant is based in Morocco, roughly a 6.5-hour drive from the nearest city. Majda Barosh is the laboratory coordinator there.
We start from just like one droplet of seawater, and then we continue adding natural seawater and nutrients until we reach bigger volumes. In the laboratory, the volume that we would like to reach would be around 100 liters or 60 liters, depending on the species that we're trying to cultivate. And then we transfer it to the greenhouse, where we keep diluting and adding natural seawater to it until we get to a volume of 40 tons of water. And then we transfer that to the outside pond till we reach the biggest pond that we have.
The whole life cycle is about 30 days, and the system is harvested every day. We remove all the algae and return the seawater back to the ocean.
We get what we call the biomass of the microalgae. We dry that, and we're working on burying the microalgae in the desert. The microalgae will be sequestrating the carbon from the atmosphere. Burying it would prevent it from going up in the atmosphere again.
In the future, Brilliant Planet is also planning to build much larger ponds on neighboring land in Morocco, and then onto countries like Chile, Peru, or South Africa. Seeing the small scale and the complexity working with governments in remote areas, it's hard to imagine this all expanding quickly. But Brilliant Planet wants to make their technology so easy and intuitive that they could just license it to local operators to run by themselves. The benefits of carbon removal will only materialize if we can scale up these technologies. And someone's going to have to pay for it.
This industry is only going to make sense if it can scale by selling offsets into a carbon market. If you're growing biomass in a pool, and then you take out the biomass, you dry it, and then you bury it, it's very easy to understand how much carbon is in the biomass. If, on the other hand, you're adding alkalinity and you're hoping that increases the rate of CO2 absorption from the ocean, that's a lot harder to tell. So that's actually what all the companies developing ocean alkalinity methods really need to prove, because at the moment, people are willing to bet on them and say, we'll pay you to develop the technology. But the reality is no one's going to pay for this if there's not a scientifically agreed upon way to measure the carbon that's absorbed through these methods.
In the end, we'll probably use a mixed bag of carbon removal solutions, where oceans might or might not play a part. But experts caution that before larger versions of these novel technologies can be considered, we should first know all the risks and whether they even work at all. And that will take time.
Whatever approaches will be used, we need enough information to take an informed decision. And of course, the decision needs to be taken not by us as scientists, but by society at large. And I see it as our responsibility to speed up obtaining that information.
All the ideas I talked about this episode are interesting, but they're also extremely risky, and there are no guarantees. Even if we drastically reduce emissions, there will be areas of the planet that will become uninhabitable in the coming years. So some people have argued that we need to start thinking about Plan C, managed retreat. It's a daunting idea, and one that's loaded with complications. Alice Adey will explain how it works and what's at stake.
You've gone vegan, you recycle your plastic, you always drive electric. You've even replaced holidays with staycations.
Welcome everybody, welcome to a very spontaneous staycation.
Welcome back to another staycation vlog. I'm going on a staycation.
It's 2040 and you've done your part in fighting climate change. But it's not enough. You live by the sea and all those reports of sea level rise you've been reading for the past 20 years weren't exaggerating. The seawall didn't work. There's a tsunami warning and a giant storm is 3 hours away. What would you do? Would you rush and leave everything behind to escape? Or would you stay, take your chances and ride that wave? Or can we avoid that worst case scenario by taking action right now so that you're never forced to make that awful choice? We're experiencing the climate crisis in a lot of different ways. Some are slow burn existential threats looming on the horizon. And some are sudden disasters that can wash away entire communities in a flash. As climate breakdown continues to overwhelm various parts of the planet, we're constantly on the run, away from rising seas and rising temperatures. If things continue like this, climate migration will completely reshape our lives and redraw world maps. Because we're not talking about thousands or even millions of people here.
The UN's International Organization for Migration estimates there could be 1.5 billion environmental migrants by 2050.
They're fleeing places like Guatemala, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Bangladesh, where extreme weather is making some areas increasingly difficult to live in. So they have no choice but to pack up their bags. This is the next phase of the climate crisis.
Climate migration isn't a question of if, but a question of when.
Climate migration will reshape the world.
And we need to be prepared. Like this community here in Fiji. In 2014, after years of flooding and saltwater erosion, 140 people in the little village of Vunidongola, instead of waiting for when it's too late, did something surprising.
Today, we launched the first project in Fiji to save an entire village from the rise in sea levels caused by climate change.
They got up and moved. With help from the government, they relocated as a community. This is called managed retreat. The idea of proactively moving communities away from climate vulnerable areas before disaster strikes. Managed retreat has taken many forms. Governments buying out vulnerable neighborhoods, entire communities moving together as a group, or new settlements bringing a group of people together. But in every scenario, it's a massive challenge. Moving communities means thinking about food, jobs, businesses, social networks. That's why managed retreat has always been considered a kind of radical idea, a last resort for when really hits the fan.
Managed retreat has become two dirty words.
But to be honest, we can't really think of it like that anymore, because that reality is fast becoming our new normal. And some countries have already started experimenting with it. Look at Bangladesh, a country with limited resources to protect its most vulnerable areas from rising sea levels.
Every year, climate change is forcing 500,000 Bangladeshis from their rural homes. Most end up in Dhakar's city slums where space is running out.
The government has started to build around 20 new climate-resilient towns with the aim of helping people move and settle there. And this is all before disaster hits in full scale. The point is, they're doing this proactively and not reactively. Look, managed retreat isn't perfect. In many ways, it's problematic. But what it really comes down to is it's no one's first choice to leave their home. Relocation in whatever form is hard. People stand to lose livelihoods, family connections, ties to their cultures, not to mention access to basic things like healthcare, food, water, and mental health support. There are also huge social justice questions at play here. Who gets to decide who moves where and when? Who pays for it? How will communities continue to be supported? If not done right, managed retreat can even widen historic inequalities.
Winter storms are literally eating the village alive.
In the US, 500 people in the native Alaskan island of Kivalina have been trying to relocate after years of coastal flooding. But they couldn't get federal funding to do that. Since 2008, they've been fighting a legal battle and still haven't secured support from the government. The ice they use to freeze and preserve food is melting, and everything is taking a massive mental toll there. It's left the island struggling. But it doesn't always go wrong. Remember Fiji? Turns out, consulting communities on how to plan their move, empowering them to make decisions, and giving them resources they need were crucial for success, and even left the communities with improved social, ecological, and health outcomes. That move was successful because the people had agency. Don't get me wrong, managed retreat will never be the ideal choice. It's complicated and radical and very, very expensive. Lower income countries need a lot more money from the richer north to help them adapt to climate change. And who knows when that's coming, because we've been talking about it for quite a while now.
The money that they said, for example, in 2015, is supposed to be $100 billion each year. None of it has realized to date.
And as always, not only do these countries not have enough resources, they're also the most vulnerable to climate disasters. I get it. You think the word retreat implies defeat, but it couldn't be further away from that. It's about facing the challenge head on and facing it together. Because a climate migration crisis is a global crisis. Every one of us is impacted. The way I see it is managed retreat can give us a chance to avoid trying to salvage our status quo and perhaps instead intentionally designing a sustainable and just future while preparing for what we know is yet to come. Because disaster never strikes with enough warning.
That's all for this episode of Getting Warmer. When it comes to last resorts, the best option is to not need them in the first place. So we should absolutely stay focused on getting off fossil fuels, period. Exclamation mark, underline, bold. But as the unforgivable carbon math keeps adding up, we may need to stay open to some less than ideal solutions. Next episode, I'll be covering the future of water. How do we adapt to the severe droughts of the future? How will that adaptation impact our politics? And was stay thirsty a catchphrase or a far-sighted tip on water conservation? I'm Kal Penn. Thanks for watching.